the question that entered my mind was, why do we just have accelerators? We have accelerators for creators, we have accelerators for companies, we have accelerators for careers. Why don't we have decelerators? And in that moment, it just like snapped. And then the next morning, literally standing at the same location, the word downshift entered my mind. And I was like, oh, interesting. We need a decelerator program and it needs to be called Downshift.
Steve Schlafman is an executive coach, writer, and professional transition guide who has created the world's first Decelerator. Through his own journey and working with some of the world's top entrepreneurs and investors, Steve has realized the power in slowing down to move into a deeply aligned and purpose-filled life.
And I'm making no decisions for at least the next 12 months. And all I did was coach and write. That's it. In that year, I just realized, wow, this is so much more enjoyable. I'm being way more deliberate and methodical, and I'm starting to really figure out what matters to me.
Because we live in a culture obsessed with racing off to the next thing, the idea of decelerating can turn people off. But what if by slowing down and taking the extra time to find direction, we actually ended up speeding up in the long run?
If you were to get lost in the wilderness and talk to a survival expert, they would say, sit down, stop moving, because you could get even more lost by just moving and moving and moving. Sit down and breathe. Downshifting isn't about downshifting your life into perpetuity. It's not about completely slowing down. It's about learning a new way to navigate change and transition with more presence, intention, and clarity.
Both Steve and I agree, when we take the extra time and space to discover what truly matters and find deep alignment, that's when the magic happens. Life becomes more enjoyable and we can accomplish with ease.
I have a family, and what I have discovered through downshifting my life, and by the way, I'm not prescribing to anybody in the program that they have to fully downshift their life in the way that I have, but I'm actually finding myself, I'm way more productive than I've ever been in my entire life. And I don't work a minute over 40 to 45 hours a week. But when it's aligned with your values, you're having a long-term mindset. Doesn't matter how much you get done in a day, a week, or a month, as long as you're oriented in the right direction and moving in a way that truly aligns with what matters most to you.
Before we get into this conversation, I want to ask you to join this amazing community of consciousness explorers. This whole idea of pursuing expanded consciousness and the boundaries of human potential while living a modern life is relatively new, which is why we interview revered masters, teachers, experts, and practitioners to help you on your own journey. To stay up to date on the latest conversations, simply click subscribe below and you'll be notified each time a new episode comes out. I am so grateful for all of your support and comments. I love reading them. Now let's dive into this conversation. Steve, what's up, my friend?
Hey, brother.
I don't know if you know this, but you are Evolution FM's first repeat guest. And so we are honored to bring you back for round two.
I am aware of that, and I was actually thinking about that this morning as I was mentally preparing to be on the show. And it really is an honor, and I'm deeply appreciative of the second trip back.
And you know, man, look, the reason that I wanted to do this is just because I'm such a believer in you, and I'm a huge believer in what you're creating, which we're going to get into the episode. And I think maybe to frame this up, why does the world need a decelerator, and what does that even mean? Because it's not a term that you really hear ever.
Yeah, well, maybe even before I can answer that question directly, which I will, is I can share how I got to the concept. And so for those of you who haven't heard the first episode, I'm a professional transition coach and guide. I work with high performers navigating transitions, both work and life, though predominantly work. And I ultimately help them move through liminal space with more presence, intention, and clarity so that they can ultimately self-author a path forward that feels deeply in alignment with their values and desires. So I just want to name that. And maybe like 2 months ago, it was a Saturday morning. I was at my it was like 6:30. My family was sleeping. I was doing dishes, and I had this epiphany. And the question that entered my mind was, why don't why do we just have accelerators? We have accelerators for creators, we have accelerators for companies, we have accelerators for careers. Why don't we have decelerators? And in that moment, it just like snapped. And I knew it was a profound inquiry. And then the next morning, literally standing at the same location, the word downshift entered my mind, and I was like, "Oh, interesting. We need a decelerator program, and it needs to be called Downshift." And I did a quick search. There's no one using the term Downshift in a coaching context, and I grabbed the URL, and we're off to the races. But to answer your question directly, Scott, about why the world needs it, is because the world is speeding up. The world is speeding up. We all have phones. We are all bombarded with just a constant barrage of information in our lives. Our lives are getting more complex, especially for those that are hitting midlife. I generally consider midlife starting around 35 and extending into our mid to late 50s. And so between all the information hitting us, between all the things going on at home with families, yes, partners, kids, aging parents, it's just it's a chaotic time for anybody, and the world is getting more complex. There's more change, and so for all of these reasons, it's abundantly clear to me that this is exactly what we need. We need to decelerate, especially as things speed up, and they are speeding up. I think everybody feels that.
Yeah, and I can't help but reflect on just kind of the paradox of this creation, because a lot of people, I think there's a unified desire to find their purpose, like to find their highest potential, right? Everybody kind of wants that. And the creation of this program and this idea, its origination occurred when you were doing something mundane early in the morning. It wasn't through an exercise of drinking a coffee and going through a T chart of the pros and cons and good ideas and using intellect. It was much more of kind of an inspired, emergent experience in the stillness. And
it's such a great point. It really came out of the ether. And what's amazing is also the name Downshift. There was no whiteboard session. There was no testing names with friends. I didn't even ask anybody about the name. Like, actually, that's not true. I brought it up to my wife, and she's like, "Oh, that's great. Go with it." But it was just this like deep inner knowing in that moment that this was what I was going to go and do. That there didn't have to be any analysis.
That's right. I find whether we're talking about a spouse or whether we're talking about an idea or a book, like there is these moments of when and it's just one of the best feelings in the world. And I think the way that those arise is kind of counter to what we're told is going to help us progress in society. And, I think a lot of people, they hear decelerate, they hear downshift, and there's probably a lot of resistance that comes up there. And I think that would be something fun for us to unpack.
Yeah. Well, I think about my own journey where there has been a tremendous amount of deceleration, right? If you think about my life, and we've known each other now, almost 13 years. So we've had the benefit of knowing each other across a fairly long period of time. My life was crazy, running for meetings, networking, events, like constant hustle. The hustle culture is was a meme that I fully bought into. To now, what my life is like, I'm living in upstate New York. I have a family, and what I have discovered through downshifting my life. And by the way, I'm not prescribing to anybody in the program that they have to fully downshift their life in the way that I have, but I'm actually finding myself, I'm way more productive than I've ever been in my entire life. And I don't work a minute over 40 to 45 hours a week. And so coming back to the question, Scott, around this idea of downshifting, downshifting isn't about giving up ambition. It's not about coming to a complete stop. Now, for some, they're going to need to because they're burnt out or they need a complete reset. Others are going to continue to progress in their own way. Like I think about myself in the year 2021, where I said, I'm making no decisions. I had just shut down my venture fund where I was coaching predominantly most of the time, and then I was also investing as like an angel. And I decided not to move forward with another fund. And I said, I'm making no decisions for at least the next 12 months. And all I did was coach and write. That's it. And in that year, I just realized, wow, this is so much more enjoyable. I'm being way more deliberate and methodical, and I'm starting to really figure out what matters to me, what really matters to me. And that is what ultimately opened up the space for me to say, I'm leaving executive coaching. I'm going to go work with professionals in transition. And now, downshift. And so downshifting has been very beneficial.
I think people probably hear something like, I'm making no decisions, and that's incredibly anxiety inducing. And there's probably a lot of things that come up around how impractical that is. What does that experience look like?
Well, where I would start with that is getting really curious about that specific perspective. Where did you learn that that's impractical? Where did those messages come from? Who taught you that? Just I want to know you better. And who might you be if you're not active? How might that feel? What's underneath that? So there's an opportunity for us just to slow down and get really curious about why this is the way that we see the world. It's a filter by which we see the world. I saw the world through this lens.
So did
Occasionally, I still see it through this lens, if I'm being completely honest. Yeah. And so, what I would say to this person is that your desire to be productive, to achieve great things, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, let's honor that. Let's appreciate that. And can you also see how it's limiting you from expressing something even greater to the world, to fully stepping into what brings you energy and aliveness?
Yeah. And I love this so much, man. It's a really counterintuitive thing relative to the predominant narrative that our highest, in my experience, like the most creativity, the most aliveness, like the most profound ideas, they come when I'm just present. They come when I'm just in the moment, right? And it actually is a huge constraint on my creativity Like I think of creativity like it's like this energy that wants to just emerge out of us. And when we have the rigidity that says, no, but I have to do this today, or no, but this needs to get done, or no, whatever, which certainly there are practicalities, but that rigidity, it actually like blocks what wants to come through. Like you actually put a constraint, an artificial constraint on it. And, the paradigm of really just kind of more moving towards the unfolding, more moving towards the present moment, more following that curiosity each day. Like you're right, dude. It does result in more profound outcomes.
Yeah, the word that's coming to mind as I tune you in, Scott, is serendipity. Is this idea of when we allow ourselves just a little bit of space, and we're able to step into what it is that wants to come through us, come out of us, that creativity in that open space is stepping into the serendipity, so that it's like we don't even know what's going to come of this. And what I find is that the more we're willing to wade in those waters, the more we realize, wow, there's a lot more here than I even imagined. It's why it's actually something that this is a big part of my philosophy, which is, as I think about constructing the program for Downshift, we've cataloged over 36 different downshifting activities. One person might want to get really still and meditate for 30 to 60 minutes a day. For another person, stillness can completely be disorienting. And then they start getting in their heads like, oh, I can't meditate. This doesn't work. I can't turn off the voice. So, what I'm trying to say is, well, maybe something like morning pages that really allows you to be with what wants to come through you in a way that is more active. And I think there's something to be said about being an active participant in life. Downshifting to me is about establishing presence, to use the word you use, because when we are present, that's when we have agency and choice. And that's where we get to actually really learn about ourselves and the way that we're wired and conditioned. And when we start to see the way that we're wired and conditioned, then we can begin to like deprogram, and we can start to move more in a direction that feels right and natural and aligned with, whatever it is that we value most.
Yeah, totally. It's your inquiry you talked about earlier where you were talking about like, well, where did those ideas come from? Right. I think, it's why I'm so passionate about the consciousness journey, because so often before we are kind of see that our ideas are inherited ideas, we don't really understand there's even another alternative. Many people that have been in the productivity and achievement paradigm, they don't even understand that there's another way to go about doing things and still have the material and worldly life that they want. And yeah, I mean, it's a super fascinating thing for people that haven't come face to face with that idea that their consciousness is a conditioned consciousness.
It completely is, right. And to me, I tend to be more of a contextual behaviorist, meaning that the context in which we find ourselves shapes our behavior. And so, I think this will resonate, but when we are in different environments, it's going to shape who we are, how we perceive the world, and ultimately who we become. Like we are one with our environment, whether or not we want to believe that we're separate creatures, right? With a tremendous amount of agency. And when we begin to realize that we are deeply embedded in complex systems, and that we are emerging as we move through these systems. It could be a family system, it could be an organization, it could be a community. When we realize that we, like our sense of self, our characteristics, our traits emerge from these systems, a light bulb goes off where you can begin to question and inquire about, well, what are the environments that I want to be in? And these aren't just, by the way, limited to physical environments. Think about the digital environments that we spend most of our time in. And so, again, what I'm trying to say is that part of this idea about understanding like how we're embedded in these worlds and from a place of presence and what they do to us and how they influence us and how they're either pro or against what it is that we really want and believe, we can start to have more agency.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if someone, I think the Downshift program, at least the initial version, is oriented towards people that are in transition. And I think let's say someone is just listening to this, maybe they can't actually do the program for whatever reason. Like, what is the first step of downshifting?
Yeah, so I sort of see the program over 4 phases. This is the way that we've constructed it. It will likely evolve in the next 6 weeks before we get to launch. But in terms of the phases, they're set. And the first one is around downshifting, which is helping our downshifters do a number of things. One of which is teaching the cultivation of presence. Second is starting to look at some of these habitual patterns and conditioning that prohibit us from being able to slow down a little bit. The third is having a better understanding of change and transition itself, not just from the academic lens, such as like William Bridges and the Bridges transition model, but how can we see that change and transition is everywhere we look? It's embedded in our lives, and so it's starting to help these people see that change and transition is just it's natural, and when we allow ourselves to slow down, what we actually realize is that it's like being grounded and aware is actually our natural state. And so that's going to be the first module, is really having an experience around those topics and some others, but that's the bulk. The second phase is what I like to call descending, but that word can be jarring for others. And this is where we really start to look at identity, security, and money, enoughness, relationship to work, and really begin to go deep and look at all these messages and frankly our relationship to ourselves. And so that is the second phase. The third phase is what I like to call renewal. And renewal is about really looking in the mirror and looking at values, what really matters, looking at creation, creativity, play, exploration, having fun, and then experimentation. How are we running embodied experiments, moving through the world? I love saying this. Like, I say this to every single one of my clients. We have an opportunity to make contact with reality and see how we react. And we see what the universe gives us back. And from that, we get to choose what the next step is, and the next step, and the next step. And so that will be part of the renewal phase, is teaching people how to do that. And finally, there's an integration phase, which is the integration phase. A lot of it's going to be around continuing the community support, but it's also really grounded on surrender and acceptance and faith. And so that's kind of the overarching journey. And as you can tell, I'm pretty excited about it.
I love it. I love the arc. And, just to reflect on a couple ideas that you shared, like, I think the descending phase is really interesting because as I reflect on my own patterns and like the incessant ambition, the need to get ahead, to figure it out, like all this stuff, behind all of that, there was this deep sense of not enoughness. That was like, it was like the fuel that drove it, right? It was like, it was what the rocket to the rocket engine on the back, right? It was just this like need to kind of disprove or invalidate that. And I think you see that with a lot of patterns and subconscious material where it's often there's like a master pattern or a master belief or wounds that is like propelling like all these behaviors that we don't see. So I think it's amazing that you're going to go into that.
It's such an important point that you bring up around these wounds. And by the way, if my venture capital self was listening to this conversation, be like wounds, healing, and I rejected the notion that I needed to heal for a really long time. And in the fall, I went through the Hoffman process, which for those in the audience, highly recommend it. Just incredible. And what I realized is how much shame that I was carrying and how much not enoughness was in me. And this isn't something that I was even aware of. And what I realized is that not enoughness was really harming my ability to perform in very significant ways, but it also was blocking my aliveness and my energy so that I could go and express myself and contribute to the world in even greater ways.
Totally, man. And it's really like the manifestation of things like not enoughness, they operate in covert ways, right? That become clear in retrospect. Like an example of that just comes to mind as I think about my own shame is like, I will steer away from certain decisions or certain activities to avoid have anything in the outside world coming in contact with that shame. And it's a really crazy experience to be like, oh yeah, I have free will, I have agency. And then to realize, well, until you look at these underlying things that are having a huge impact on your thoughts, your emotions, what you decide to do, you realize that your free will is actually a very constrained free will. And that's like, it's like the healing, which I think about as just like returning to the natural state. That's literally what healing means, is returning it to its original state. Like that healing actually just creates just true free will, true freedom, true agency, true capacity to move through the world. And I think that's something that a lot of people, everybody wants, but they can't see how constrained their experience actually is until they kind of get into this stuff.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective. And I think something you say that was really important that I want to just like pick up that thread, which is around looking back and seeing all these examples of our lives where we've made decisions where then in retrospect it's like actually I didn't have as much choice and agency and free will as I thought I had. And I actually wrote a post on my birthday. My this was over almost 18 months ago. On my 43rd birthday, I wrote a post that said, "How did I end up here?" And I was reading Let Your Light Speak by Parker Palmer. And he talks about how as we move from childhood into adolescence, we're disabused of our original giftedness. And the second half of life, if we're conscious and aware, it's how do we go and reclaim that giftedness again? And so I actually went back and I literally started as like, well, how did I pick my college? How did I pick my college major? Oh, well, my brother drove a BMW. He went into business. So I chose business. How did I end up at Microsoft? Oh, well, my academic advisor said it was the top job to get. So of course I'm going to go for the top internship in Northeastern. Of course I get the job at Microsoft. They give me an offer. How can I turn it down? It was 2001 when Microsoft is one of the best companies in the world. I mean, they reclaimed their glory. And anyhow, the point is, I kept on. How did I get into venture? Oh, well, I saw a tweet by Ben Lair and decided I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. And you start to see this play out in all these ways. And you're like, fuck, I actually have been moving forward without much agency. And in fact, old patterns from the way that I was raised were driving me towards success, money, and power, because when I was a kid, my father wasn't around, so wanted love, money, because my mother complained about money every single day when I was a kid. God bless her, raised by a single mother. And then the third is I was picked on because I was fat. Power. Oh, interesting. So these three core things when I was a childhood, like traumas in some ways, are the things that were driving me unconsciously for 25 plus years.
Yeah. It's a wild revelation, isn't it?
I'm almost speechless just recounting this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like I had my own version of that where I realized some kid when I was on the bus in kindergarten called me a worthless piece of shit, like over and over again. And like, that was like the seed that was planted where it's like, you're worthless. And like that drove like such an incessant desire for perfection. And it's just a crazy ass thing to realize. You're like, wow, my whole life was like a reaction to these experiences that I didn't even remember, until I kind of went through my own subconscious work.
I think of this conversation I had with a client yesterday, truly gifted founder that's in transition. He was telling me a story. When he was younger, the most popular kid in the class shared his birthday.
Mm.
And that has always made him feel like he can never stand out.
Wow.
And so as a result of that, he compensates for wanting to stand out, for seeking status, because he felt when he was a kid for many years, he was never recognized on his birthday.
Wow. It's crazy. It's really, really crazy. And I would just comment on, one thing that I would also share that I think is really cool about this whole idea is that I think one of the conditioned ideas is that success and achievement and all of those things are gonna get us what we want, right? They're gonna make us feel how we want to feel. And it's my perspective that I actually get a lot more fulfillment around discovering these things about myself and life and reality than selling my company or something big, right? Like it's the process of self-discovery is actually where the highest fulfillment is.
Yeah, it's real. Yeah, it's so beautifully said. It's so beautifully said. I had this moment where I actually wrote a piece about this maybe 2 years ago, called "The Mountain You're Climbing Doesn't Exist," and this idea that we're always moving that goalpost. Like I'm gonna start a company, and then it's gonna be venture backed by so and so VCs, and then I'm gonna sell it, and we're always hoping that next thing is going to be the thing that makes us whole, that makes us feel complete. And what the reality is we don't feel complete, and so we have to go for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And that's not to say like striving to bring new things into the world isn't a noble pursuit or to have a certain level of impact. But what I noticed in my own experience was that each successive achievement was only having me crave the next one even more and more and more and more and more. And having gone through this process of downshifting, what I realized is, especially living in nature now, I'm in the Hudson Valley on the edge of the Catskills. And the moments that I cherish the most is like I'm on my bike and it's a Friday afternoon in the late spring and it's 80 degrees and the sun is on my face. And I was like, no, this is what I want. The achievements and the dollars in the bank account or the showering of the praise. It's those moments when I feel most alive, when I'm fully present, doing the things that I value the most. Same thing with being with my girls. Same thing.
I hope you're enjoying this conversation so far. If you like what you hear, let me know by clicking like, subscribing to the channel, and responding with a comment around something that you found interesting in the conversation so far. In addition to these videos, I do a lot of writing on the exploration of consciousness and my own personal revelations in my newsletter called Consciousness, the Doorway to Human Evolution. To receive these updates and more, all you need to do is simply head to the link in the description below and you'll be added to the community of 20,000 plus consciousness explorers receiving weekly ideas and inspiration in their inbox. I look forward to hearing from you there. Now let's get back to the show. What I've observed is it's the richness of life, and specifically if we talk about accomplishment and achievement, because I think a lot of people, they think about transition and it's like they want to go do their next thing. It goes from what you achieve to how you achieve. And
bingo.
For me, the how that provides the enrichment and fulfillment is the moments of synchronicity, is seeing things emerge together like beautifully and organically. It's like all of those experiences where you're like in awe of life. Like that's the fucking nectar, dude. That's where it's at. And who cares if it even becomes something, because you get to experience magic.
Yeah, it's such a great point that it's moving from the what to the how. And what's amazing is I think back to my investing days, and again, worked my ass off, was obsessed with it, in it all the time, but I wasn't focused on the how. Versus now, where I've created this life where I'm intensely focused on the how. And I argue, like, listen, I don't know where downshift is going to go, but there's an instinct in me that tells me we're going to be successful. Like there's just like there's a conviction and a belief in the idea, because I'm doing it in a way that is now totally aligned with my values and what is most important in the world. And then the last thing I'll say related to this, which is also related to the how, is how do you use time as a dimension? Where I think most high achievers is like, I need to go, I need to push. I like this week, I need to get this amount done. And it's like, well, what happens if you're focused on the how, but over a long period of time? And for me with downshift, like I've had people reach out about like, what would you do with some money? And I said, I'm not even thinking about that. Like, I don't like, to me, this is going to be a 5 to 10 year journey. And it's how do I sit with it, knowing that if it's a long-term journey, then I don't have to get everything done right this second. And that I can trust the way that things are going to unfold.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. It's amazing. And I think it speaks to this interesting thing I've observed where you're kind of what you're talking about is like you have this compulsion and just natural desire and inspiration. Inspiration is a good word, to do this thing, right? And you don't know what it's going to become. You don't even really know how you're going to get there, but you know the inspiration and the energy is there. And back to conditioning, I find it very paradoxical that we as a society think that that's actually not safe to follow that. Like, oh my God, I have this inspiration and I don't know what it's going to become or how it's going to invest, and I don't have a plan and all these things, like, so it's not safe for me to just sow into it. And it's very funny because I imagine there was a time in human existence where that was the safest thing to do. It's like that was the most obvious, no duh thing you should to do, and we've just gotten away from that. And I'm excited that people out like you are out there advocating for that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and to me, I think again, this comes back to what we find, and I know you've written about it with responsive reality, which I believe is one of your finest posts. Your riff with Mark.
Thank you.
Like when you slow down enough and you begin to make contact with reality, and you start seeing synchronicity and coincidences and doors opening, it's like, wow. I actually had this conversation with Steve March, who was my coach for most of last year. He's the founder of an amazing organization called Alethea. And I remember saying to him in one session, I said, it feels easy. Like coaching feels easy to me. And like building my coaching business feels easy to me. And like, I feel like it should, like, I want to be like, I feel like it should be harder. And he said, well,
Interesting.
Why does it need to be hard? Like, where did, like, what that part of you that thinks it should be hard, right? And then there's that light bulb of like, oh, actually, it doesn't need to be hard. Like, it doesn't need to be miserable. It like, and so for me, one of the things I'm starting to do is trust, like, and following like what feels easeful as opposed to what's going to be miserable and hard. Hard and challenging are different. Like I'm up for a challenge. Like throw me in the deep end. But there's a difference between challenge and pushing against reality.
Yeah. Well, such a powerful revelation. And yeah, I think it speaks to the notion of just questioning like so many of these ideas that were just like imprinted onto us, like, and the hustle startup culture, which we were both products of. I mean, that was the whole MO, dude. That was the whole thing, is like fucking grind, and like it's hard, and like, you know, being successful is a product of work, grinding it out and making smart decisions and like doing all the right things. And like what the funny thing is, and I would love your take on this, is that I'm pretty sure reality conforms to whatever you believe, whatever you put in there. And so it's like, if you fucking think it's going to be hard, guess what, buddy? It's going to be hard.
Exactly. No, I completely subscribe to that thought. And so, listen, that doesn't mean that people don't have real challenges in their lives. Like, you know, like that absolutely is the case. And I think in terms of mindset is how are we approaching these hardships? How are we like from what place are we approaching this? Are we approaching it from a place of curiosity? You know, going back to my teachers, Jim Detmer and Diana Chapman. Like, are we coming to it from above or below the line? And when we shift and we're able to really get curious, like now we're talking, like as another, like we're increasing our bandwidth to be with more. We're opening up to more possibility.
Yeah, I love that, man. I love that. You know, one thought that I have as people think about this, because Look, I have been in the abyss, as our friend David Spink says about it, where you're in between things. You're like, what am I going to do with my life? Like, this sucks. Like, I need to climb my way out of it
As quickly as possible.
as quickly as possible, right? Which promotes the speed, right? Versus sitting in it. And, you know, what would you like for people that are listening out there right now that feel that way, that are like, I am just lost? You know, what does the downshift paradigm call them to embrace?
Yeah. Well, having been lost multiple times, I know what it's like to be there. And for those of you listening that are in that position, I feel you, and I can promise you that you're going to get to the other side of it. I can't tell you when or how long it's going to take. Often these things take longer than you would like, but you'll get through it. I promise. And you'll feel really good when you're on the other end of it, because there's going to be a whole new expression and perspective. Now, that said, to get to the heart of Scott's question, to me, when you're in this space and you're fully disoriented, you've detached from the world that you came in. You're no longer who you used to be, but you're not who you're going to be, and you don't have the same structures and habits, and everything just feels disorienting. There's two things that I always recommend. One is slowing down. If you were to get lost in the wilderness and talk to a survival expert, they would say, sit down, stop moving, because you could get even more lost by just moving and moving and moving, or end up rewind and and so what they'll say is sit down and breathe. Listen. Do you hear a stream in the background? Look. Do you see any perches where you can go get a different vantage point? The idea is just to slow down and wait. Maybe someone comes and finds you. And so it's not too dissimilar. Slow down. The second is, and I love this, my friend Bobby, as he and I were jamming on his own experience, said, find your through lines. And so the through lines are, what are the things that the values, your essence, your capabilities, the rocks of relationships that are going to be constant, that are going to be with you. They were with you in your last thing, and they're going to be with you in your next thing. And can you hold on to those as a refuge while you're lost? And to me, this comes back to Scott's point of the how. Is it creativity? Do you love creating? Do you love jamming? One of my clients is a researcher, and he's in transition right now, and his favorite thing is going and jamming with friends and geeking out on research papers. Like it just gives him so much energy. And so in that lostness, he's using that specific instance to ground him, to bring him back to his aliveness, to remind him that there are moments where it's going to be okay. And so for those listening, as like, find your through lines, lean into the things that bring you alive, lean into your values, the things that do create fulfillment. And, for those listening, it could just be as simple as putting my daughter to bed, giving her a bottle and looking in her eyes. But slow down and follow the through lines, and you'll make it. I promise.
I love that. And it sounds like part of Downshift advocates for some type of, finding some type of like ritual that helps you slow down. And you guys have like a library of potential things, right? Like meditation.
We're in the process of building all that out. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I like
so
that.
there's going to be a library. We've already started to construct it, and then again, coming back to the various practices, and part of the program is personalized coaching with yours truly, and
Yeah.
part of that coaching is going to be around um, how do we help you downshift in the context of your life. So there could be a 35-year-old that doesn't have a family, might have a partner, be married. Their context is going to be very different than the hard charging executive mom with 2 kids and running a household, and their lives are going to be very different. And so I'm not the right person to say, like, I'm going to prescribe you the downshift program and it's going to be for everybody. Like, it's a one size fits all. So it's how do we work with each person in the context of their lives to implement some of these practices to start to create groundedness, awareness, and presence such that they can start to move forward and make contact with reality and see what actually happens.
Mm. Yeah, it's I love it. That's amazing. I think the experimentation mindset is also it's just such a great posture for life, right? I like, you know, there's, to me, like, you could just experiment with anything. Like, you could experiment with what is it like to chew my food 30 times before I swallow it and really enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that downshift feel like? Do I actually enjoy my meal better? I don't know.
That's an experiment, right? Like, how does that make me feel? What's interesting is experiments feel obvious, right? Like, I think experiment is a term that a lot of people can wrap their heads around. But what's on the other side of an experiment? Potential failure.
Hmm.
And so this idea of helping people, I'm obviously getting deep into the program, but as it relates to experiments, what's our relationship with failure? Right? What's our experience with bigness versus smallness related to experiments? Chewing your food 30 times, that's a small experiment. But high performer, like our former selves, that's not an experiment. Like, an experiment is actually launching the Decelerator. That's an experiment. And so it's helping people also look at their relationship to failure in the context of experiments.
That's such a good point, and frankly, an oversight that I have, because I think of experiments as just learning. Like, there is no failure. But I could totally see where someone could have an alternative point of view where an experiment is about getting some certain outcome. And in that
Yes.
context.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Scott. Yesterday I had a coaching session. My client shows up. I'm like reading her body language. And she said, Steve, I just need to clear the air. I was like, I know. And she's like, I didn't do the thing I said I was going to do. And I was like, okay. And she's like, processing it in that moment. And the thing and she's a relatively new client. And what I said to her is, we get to learn when we take action, and we also get to learn when we don't take action. And there's an opportunity to learn when we run the experiment and when we fail to run the experiment for any reason, including procrastination, fear, whatever comes up. And so I think, like, that idea that we can learn in any scenario, including when we don't do the experiment. The other thing I would say is there is a real tendency to want to like get it right with experiment. And there's no getting it right. It's just learning. It's just learning.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's, with that, there's, I guess there's some self-worth tied up in, the outcome, right? Like, and think making meaning of it about you, right? As if it's like related to you, when most of these things are just, I don't know, just, there's just ways of trying things and seeing what happens.
Exactly. And I had this revelation post Hoffman, where I'm currently working with a truly exceptional Hoffman coach by the name of Mark Kaplan. Feel like I have to give him a shout out because he's truly gifted coach. And I remember leaving Hoffman. I had lost my dad literally 2 days after I left Hoffman. And I came out of that and I hired Mark to help me with integration in the context of losing my dad. And I remember saying to him, like, I have no motivation or desire to like write, to read the next book, to listen to the next podcast. There's just no energy, not even an ounce of energy to do anything. And he helped me see that inaction is an action, that inaction is a decision that we're consciously able to make. And that shift was really powerful because it then gave me permission to own it, where I'm like owning this decision to do nothing because I'm feeling my body. Like I just don't, there's no energy that wants to move forward in this way, and honoring and trusting that.
I like that. I also really like your point around just the fact that you didn't do something as a learning opportunity. And I had a huge experience with that, where I had this, in a meditation, to come through to basically fire somebody at troops. And there were all of these logical reasons and stories I came up with that basically made me keep the person on, right? It was like, oh, well, it doesn't make sense for this reason, it doesn't make sense for that, or it doesn't make sense for this reason, blah, 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 blah. And that, for reasons I won't get into on this podcast, like, that was a terrible decision to not let that person go. Like, it ended up being this like super long drug out thing that like caused a lot of friction inside of the organization and lack of performance and all this stuff. And I was like, wow, like, this is an interesting learning of what happens when I don't trust that inner voice. This is just as powerful as trusting it, like, for what I could learn from it.
What was the pattern that kept you from making the decision?
Oh, I just think it was just a lack of trust. That I think it was just the idea that at that point in my journey, like, my inner intuition was not safe relative to well-reasoned decisions.
What emotion was there for you? Was there?
I think I was just nervous. I was just anxious. I wanted to get it right. Like, I wanted to get it right. And
I see.
Also probably felt some overwhelm, right? Because every single time you fire somebody, it's like, well, now I need to go find a new person. And what does this mean for me picking up some of that person's responsibility, and like all of that, right? That can seep into.
Well, what I'm hearing is that, sort of the intellectual optimizer part, and not allowing your, like, coming up over the top of your intuition to really be able to listen to that.
Yeah, totally, man. That's spot on. And, I think another point that you touched on that I think is really interesting we talked a little bit about synchronicity and kind of like just things happening around us. Like, it's so, when you first see synchronicity, I don't know about you, but I was like, holy shit, has this always been happening? Like, have the like signs and connections and meaningful coincidences unfolding around me, like, has that always been there and I just couldn't see it? Or is this a new phenomenon? And I'd love to get your perspective, but I actually think because I was moving so fast, because I was not present, and because I just had a low, like less, I was just less aware, right? It was that I couldn't see it. Like I couldn't see those things. Like they were always, that intelligence was always there. It just was not visible to me.
Yeah, because you weren't aware and looking. There's a term, and I am weaving this teaching into the program. Um, there's a term known as the adjacent possible that was developed by Stuart Kaufman of the Santa Fe Institute. He's a researcher there, and then later much popularized by Stephen Johnson, that wrote a number of phenomenal books, one of which is called How Innovation Happens, which is a phenomenal book. In the book, Johnson talks about this idea of the adjacent possible, which he actually named a Substack, which is in certain things need to happen in order to unlock new things to happen. So what happens is a combination of things come together, and those combination of things that emerge now are able to lead to the emergence of new things. And so, for example, let's just use the technology example. We couldn't have had the iPhone without GPS or the chip or a dizzying amount of innovations that had to come together for it to even be possible. And I believe that moving through transition is very, very similar, where at any given moment, we have a number of doors that we can choose to walk through. And we open one of those doors. Like actually, my mentor, Jerry Colonna, said that the Buddha said that there were 10,000 doors that led you into the Dharma. And this was his advice to me many years ago, was don't worry about which door to pick. Just pick the one that feels most resonant and walk through it. And in the case, the adjacent possible, what Stephen Johnson would say is you walk through that first door and now you have three more doors. Three doors that were completely unknown to you are now visible. And using our philosophy at Downshift, how do you feel your way into choosing the next door? And then the next one, and the next one. And bringing this all the way back to your point, because I know I'm meandering, is around synchronicity. Is what starts to happen is we start making connections with people. People start reaching out to us. We put things out on Twitter, and it feels like magic, but it's just because of the way you're moving through the world. It's this idea, it's like, the harder I work, the luckier I get.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. I love that perspective of how to view that phenomena, which is it's just a wonderful experience. There's really no other way to describe it. It's just, you just feel like you're in the flow of life.
Yeah, and it again, like it embraces, and this word is, in the zeitgeist now, is this unfolding, right? And it's like you walk through a set of doors, you take a step. It's like, take the next step, you see, oh, interesting. And it's interesting. Like if you watch Frozen 2, which I'm in the business of doing since I have a 5-year-old, there's a song about taking the next right step. And it's so simple, but when it's aligned with your values and you're having a long-term mindset, doesn't matter how much you get done in a day, a week, or a month, as long as you're oriented in the right direction and moving in a way that truly aligns with what matters most to you.
Yeah. And in that world, there is no wrong choices.
Not at all.
There's misaligned choices, but like, I think if you just are constantly doing what feels aligned and good, you know, how could you possibly get it wrong?
Well, it's trusting that our nature, like that internal compass of like what's right and what's wrong,
Mm,
right? It's that question of what is my life asking of me right now.
yeah.
And but interesting coming around like right and wrong. I was talking with our mutual friend Sphinx last week, and he was talking to someone about, you can't get it, this idea of you can't get it wrong. um, he was talking to someone who was afraid of like regret, like wrestling with this decision. I need to get this thing right, like this is going to be a big career decision. And he said, are there any decisions that you've regretted, like truly regretted in your life? She's like, no, never. He's like, so you're going to regret this? And she's like, no.
Yeah. And I also think it's like, if you just like decide to say, I'm going to do what feels good and what I believe is aligned, and you follow it, like, are you really going to regret that? Like, if the outcome isn't the perfect outcome, right? Like, whatever, but you took the action that you felt was most congruent. Like, I just find it hard to really regret that. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
Especially when you're really honoring your truth and what's important to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally, man. Well, dude, we could talk about all this stuff
I know.
forever. I love dropping in with you, man. I want to give you just an opportunity to tell people, if this conversation resonated with them and this idea of downshifting is interesting, like where they can go and learn more.
Yeah. First point that I'll make is, again, downshifting isn't about downshifting your life into perpetuity. It's not about completely slowing down. It's about learning a new way to navigate change and transition with more presence, intention, and clarity. So I just want to name that for everyone, so that we're all clear on what it means to downshift. Now, as it relates to the program specific, applications are now open. We've had applications in the first 24 hours all over the place, including Europe, which is so incredible to hear. The program applications are due April 1st, Monday, April 1st, and all final enrollment decisions will be made by April 5th, Friday, April 5th. There's only 12 spots. We're designing the container to be very intimate, and yeah, this is going to be a special community that we're in, a group of people that we're bringing together. And the program is going to kick off in the Catskills in the Hudson Valley for a 2.5 day retreat where we're all going to come together and we're going to go deep. We're going to learn a lot of things about presence, about change and transition, about how to navigate through the rest of the program, and hopefully much further beyond that. And then after that first weekend, or sorry, it's April 17th through April 19th, so it's a Wednesday through a Friday into a Friday. The rest of the program's virtual, so you can do it from anywhere in the world. We're going to meet on Tuesdays for 2 hours. It's going to be a mix of lecture, exercises, discussion. And then Thursday, we're going to have guest lectures from an incredible lineup of guests. Right now we have Benita Roy, Andy, one of my Johns, and Holly Whitaker from Recovering and Quit Like a Woman. And we have some incredible guests that are lined up. We want to keep some surprises for everybody. And it's just going to be a special program. And we'll do some one-on-one coaching. There's going to be, as we talked about, resources and practices. And at the end of it, I can't guarantee that your lostness is going to be solved or you're going to find the meaning of life and purpose. But I almost guarantee that you're going to have a new way of moving through the world and being with change and transition and a new relationship with yourself.
I love that, man. And that's the prize, right? Is like, I think it's such a good frame, right? Because like, let's say you approach something like that and you're like, cool, I'm going to find my next company. And then you find your next company and then you do that company and then you're in the same place again. Mm-hmm. And that just continues, that pattern of just like needing to figure it out just continues versus, versus the way of being, right? Which can persist through all transitions, of which, life will have a zillion of them.
Exactly. Well, there's one last point that I want to make, which is, there's a lot of differences between us and an accelerator. Clearly, accelerators, whether for companies or creators or careers, there's a very specific ending and promise. Like, you're going to have a portfolio, or you're going to have a venture-backed company, or you're going to have a new job. And those basically, entering one of those programs puts us on a very dedicated track that I would argue, coming back to the agency, could just be mimetic desire, purely based on what people are seeing and reading. There's nothing wrong with mimetic desire. I've been influenced by more than I even realize. Now, that said, what we're trying to do is something different. There are no pretenses going into this about who's going to come out with what. And so that makes this a very different program. And so what I can say is the outcome is you're gonna have a very different way of looking at change, transition in yourself.
I love it, man. Beautiful. Well, we'll make sure to link all those, the Downshift website and the announcement post, which I just thought was a very fun read. I super, super well written and enjoyed that. And, so if it's interesting, check out all those places, and love your work, man. Love jamming with you. I guess we'll definitely do a round 3 at some point, but this was a fun round 2.
Can't wait. And I'll plug it since I haven't mentioned it. Downshift.me is the URL. Downshift.me is where you can learn more.
Boom. All righty. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening. We're grateful for you and grateful for you, Steve.